War. War never changes. Sorry, I had to say that. I'm a Fallout fan. But today I'd like to talk about 8 cases, in no particular order, of military holdouts after a war has ended. It's always good when a war ends, especially for the soldiers involved. They survived. They get to go home. However, sometimes there have been cases where individual soldiers or entire units and ships have held out, sometimes long after the war they were involved with ended. It could be that the soldiers did not actually know for sure that the war was over or not. It could be that they knew something was going on, but still carried on, awaiting some official word or news. And it could have been that they knew full well that the war was over, and they just refused to surrender, at least not to their enemies. U-977, a German U-boat, a Type 7C launched in 1943. She began her last war patrol on May 2, 1945, under Oberleutnant zur See Heinz Schaefer, sailing from Kristiansand, Norway. 3 days later, Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally. Although Admiral Donitz ordered all U-boats to stand down and surrender on May 5, 1945, Oberleutnant Schaefer decided, rather than to surrender, to make a run for Argentina. It took them 107 days to make the arduous voyage, a challenging one in a small World War II-era diesel submarine. They made most of the voyage underwater, and Schaefer recorded that they spent 66 days running submerged to avoid detection. They surfaced in Mar del Plata on August 17, 1945, and hoped to find amnesty in Argentina. Unfortunately for them, this was not granted, and submarine and crew were turned over to the U.S. Navy. The U-977 ended her days as a target in 1946, and their crew were repatriated to Germany after some legal wrangling as to their status and possible war crimes. Oberleutnant Schaefer was released from custody in 1947 and wrote a book about his adventures, which in English is U-977, 66 Days Under the Water, and he lived until 1979. U-977 lives on in tales and legends, however. Wrapped up in conspiracy theories and tales of Nazi escape and survival, the U-977 is said to have been part of a fleet of U-boats that ferried Adolf Hitler, German leaders, and alien technology to Argentina and Antarctica. The Confederate sailing ship Shenandoah. A ship of the Confederate States of America, the CSS Shenandoah was launched as a commerce raider in 1863. Under the command of James Waddell, the Shenandoah had a successful career from 1864 to 1865, sinking or capturing a total of 38 Union ships. On June 27, 1865, Waddell learned from a prize ship that General Robert E. Lee's army had surrendered from a San Francisco newspaper. However, the paper also ran a statement from Confederate President Jefferson Davis that the war would be carried on. This ambiguity led Waddell to continue operations against the Union whalers in the Arctic Circle, where he captured 10 in a single day. On August 3, 1865, Waddell met the British bark Barracuda at sea. He learned that the Confederate armies were surrendering in mass and that President Davis himself had been captured. At this point, Captain Waddell knew the war was over. He took down his Confederate flag, hid his guns, and disguised his ship the best he could. Rather than surrendering to the Union forces, Captain Waddell sailed his vessel from the Pacific Ocean in the vicinity of the west coast of Mexico, west around Cape Horn, Africa, and up to Liverpool, England. It took them 3 months to make the voyage of about 9,000 nautical miles. On November 6, 1865, Waddell pulled the Shenandoah up alongside the British warship HMS Donegal and surrendered. It was the last surrender of the American Civil War. Waddell had entered Liverpool harbor flying the Confederate flag, so it was also the last official lowering of the Confederate flag in that war. The ship and most of the crew were returned to the United States. Captain Waddell lived until 1886, captaining a cargo mail ship in his later career. The Shenandoah was sold to a sultan of Zanzibar who renamed her El Majidi. On April 15, 1872, a hurricane hit Zanzibar, blowing the now El Majidi on shore with serious damage. The ship was scuttled, never to sail again. Joseph O. Shelby. Joseph O. Shelby was the leader of the Iron Brigade in the American Civil War on the Confederate side. One of the many Confederate cavalry raiding forces carrying out economic and guerrilla warfare throughout the Midwest. He had been involved in the Missouri-Kansas border war a particularly bloody frontier conflict that presaged the Civil War. During the Civil War, his most famous raid, later named after him as Shelby's Raid, was the longest cavalry raid of the war, in time and distance, covering 1,500 miles in 3 months, inflicting heavy casualties on the Union forces and millions of dollars in damage. Numerous other successful raids and battles followed for Shelby. However, in June 1865, the U.S. federal government beat the Confederacy and Shelby's cause was lost. Rather than to surrender to the hated Union forces, Shelby and about 1,000 of his troops fled south of the border into Mexico. They offered their services to Maximilian, who was then emperor in Mexico. Maximilian didn't hire them on, but he did allow the Confederate renegades to settle in Mexico at a place called Carlotta Colony near Veracruz. After Maximilian was overthrown, most of the Confederate expats made their way back into the United States. Apparently, Shelby, returning to Missouri in 1867, never officially surrendered to U.S. forces, nor was he ever captured or imprisoned. In fact, he ended up as the U.S. Marshal for the Western District of Missouri in 1893, a position that he held until his death in 1897. Shoichi Yokoi. One of the better-known Imperial Japanese Army holdouts from World War II, Shoichi Yokoi did not surrender until 1972, 28 years after U.S. forces had retaken Guam. At first, there were 9 soldiers in Yokoi's group of holdouts after the Battle of Guam in 1944. 6 eventually moved away, and 3 remained in the region that Yokoi was hiding in. In 1964, these other 2 holdouts died in a flood, and Yokoi was alone for the last 8 years. He had seen numerous newspaper articles and leaflets over the years saying that the war was over, but he didn't believe them. Finally, in 1972, he was captured during an altercation with 2 fishermen. Yokoi tried to attack them, but they overpowered him and brought him in. "It is with much embarrassment, but I have returned," said Yokoi upon his return to Japan. The remark became a popular one in his homeland. Yokoi married and was a popular television personality, becoming minorly famous for the rest of his life. He died in 1997 at the age of 82. Visitors to Guam can visit Yokoi's Cave, a tourist attraction monument to Yokoi's life. It's a reproduction, however, as the original had been destroyed in a typhoon. Operation Haudegen. In September 1944, a German supply ship and a U-boat transported a small detachment of troops to Svalbard, an island group on the Arctic Circle far to the north of Norway. They were to establish a weather station and send back weather reports to the German military. The detachment operated in this hostile far northern location until May 1945, when they lost radio contact with higher command in Germany. They had gotten the message that the war was over, but tried in vain to send out radio messages for rescue or surrender. Luckily, they had plenty of provisions, as it wasn't until September 1945 that a Norwegian whaler showed up, answering signals they had begun sending over Allied distress frequencies. They were the last group of German servicemen to surrender after the Second World War. Captain Hermann Detzner. In 1914, at the time of the outbreak of World War I, Germany controlled the northeastern part of Papua New Guinea. The region was known as Kaiser Wilhelmsland to the Germans, and in 1914 they sent Captain Hermann Detzner, a member of their colonial security forces and a surveyor, to explore the region. Detzner, with a small band of explorers, traveled deep into the jungles of New Guinea. Learning of the outbreak of World War I and subsequent seizing of Kaiser Wilhelmsland by Australian forces, Captain Detzner went deeper into the unexplored interior to avoid capture. Not wanting to surrender to the Australians, Detzner's party then spent the next 4 years living deep in the jungles, sheltered at times by German missions, and on many occasions attempting to escape into the Dutch-held area of Papua New Guinea, which was neutral at the time. He became the first European to explore much of the interior of New Guinea, and, after learning that the war had ended, finally surrendered to Australian forces in January 1919. Detzner went home to Germany, where he became famous, writing several partly fictionalized books about his adventures. He died in West Germany in 1970. Spanish troops at the Siege of Baler. In 1898, during the Philippine Revolution and Spanish-American War, a small garrison of 57 Spanish soldiers came under siege in the town of Baler. They held up in a stone church and stubbornly refused to surrender to the Philippine insurgents surrounding them. Official hostilities ended in December 1898, but the Spanish troops at Baler, starving and out of food and supplies, still refused to give up. The Filipinos tried to convince them that the war was over. They left newspapers at the door to the church, but the Spanish commander thought it was all a trick and refused to believe them. Spanish emissaries were sent to try and convince them to surrender as well, but they went unheeded as well. Finally, in May 1899, almost 6 months after the end of the war, Martin Cesaro, the Spanish commander, was convinced by an article in a newspaper regarding a friend of his. The article was either about the friend getting married or receiving a new posting. Sources are confused on what actually convinced him. But this article did convince Martin that the war was indeed over. Cesaro went home to Spain where he wrote a book. The modern-day Spanish government still considers this event with honor, and the story has twice been made into films by the Spanish and once by Filipinos. Hiroo Onoda. Probably the most famous of the various Japanese holdouts after World War II, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda held out on the Philippine island of Lubang until 1974. Onoda and 3 other soldiers actively continued a guerrilla campaign against local police and people after the war, shooting at the police and burning rice crops. Refusing to believe leaflets that were dropped to tell them that the war was over, the band dwindled over the years. One soldier, Yuichi Akatsu, walked away and surrendered in 1950, an act of desertion that made Onoda and the others even more paranoid. Shoichi Shimada was once wounded and finally killed in 1954 by an armed search party searching for the men. Kinshichi Kozuka was shot by Philippine police in 1972 after he and Onoda had been caught setting fire to a rice harvest. Finally, in 1974, Onoda was tracked down by a Japanese explorer and adventurer named Norio Suzuki. Calling him a hippie, Onoda took pictures with Norio but still refused to surrender. Onoda said that he could not surrender without a direct order from his superior officer. It so happened that the Japanese government was able to locate Onoda's former commanding officer, then Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, who is now living as a bookseller in Japan. In March 1974, he traveled to Lubang and met with Onoda. There, Taniguchi relieved Onoda of duty, after which Onoda promptly surrendered. Although Onoda had carried out property attacks and killed people during his personal campaign, he was later pardoned by then Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos on the grounds that Onoda thought the war was still going on. Although famous upon returning to Japan, Onoda was unhappy with the changes that Japan had undergone in the years that he'd been away. He spent the time in Brazil raising cattle, but finally returned to Japan, opening an educational camp for young people, known as the Onoda Shizen Juku, the Onoda Nature School. He received numerous awards and publicity, although he remained a stalwart Japanese nationalist until the end of his days, advocating return to monarchy and militarism. He died in January 2014 in Tokyo from complications from pneumonia. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you liked it. If you did, please give me a thumbs up and keep an eye on my channel. I hope to come up with some more good ideas for videos soon. Have a good day.